Doing well. I'm in Spokane, Washington, and today is our first day of good air quality. So we are happy.
Oh, good. I am glad to hear. Well, for those who are already on, Jessica and I are going to chat for a moment before I introduce her and we dive into our conversation. But as people are gathering, Jessica, throughout the Episcopal Church, one rule of thumb is that people, if something starts at 9 a.m., people will arrive around 9:05. We are existentially late.
I like it.
We are often progressive in thought, but existentially late, if that makes any sense.
Definitely.
What's the weather like there today?
It's beautiful. We can see the blue sky. We've had a lot of smoke, and so today it's nice to have that fresh air.
How close are you to fires?
We've had some fires right out. About a week ago, we had some fires right outside of the city of Spokane. But most of the smoke that we've been experiencing has been coming up from Oregon. So no, I haven't seen any flames myself, thank goodness.
Yeah. Oh, God bless everyone. This has been terrifying, and especially God bless everyone who's working to put those fires out. My goodness.
Absolutely.
Well, let's see. It's about 9:03. So why don't we go ahead and get started? We'll open with a brief prayer, and then I'll introduce you. Ready, Jessica?
Yes.
The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. This is a prayer from the Book of Common Prayer for elections. Almighty God, to whom we must account for all our powers and privileges, guide the people of the United States in the election of officials and representatives, and especially of the President of our country, that by faithful administration and wise laws, the rights of all may be protected and our nation be enabled to fulfill your purposes through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. It is my pleasure to welcome to the Dean's Forum, Dr. Jessica Mecellem, and this is the first in a three-part series. The overall title of the series is called Preparing for the Election. Jessica teaches and is a professor in the political science department at the University of the South, which is commonly called SWANY. And for those of you who are Episcopalian or attend St. John's Cathedral, many of our staff, Jessica, have degrees from SWANY. I think about 4 or 5 of us. For example, Katie Pearson graduated from SWANY, both undergrad and School of Theology. Evans Owsley, our Director of Communications, Christina Rutland, our youth minister. I have an STM from SWANY. So it's a place that's near and dear to us and has really shaped us as a staff. In a place that I love and not far from where I grew up. You have now moved to the Pacific Northwest.
Yes.
You're in a bit of a transition, but still involved in teaching at SWANY. Even closer to home than SWANY in terms of our connections to you, Jessica, your sister is a beloved and fabulous member of our parish, Michaela Barton Gowron. And we just, all of us who know Michaela here, cherish our relationship with her. And that was one of the reasons why we wanted to have you in this series, because of our close relationship to Michaela. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. This is really a pleasure to have an opportunity to reflect on some of the really important questions that you and I have discussed. And I'm so pleased to have this opportunity to share some thoughts and engage in community reflection.
Good. So we're going to dive right in. And as you know, Jessica, and just to cue everyone who's listening, we're really going to dive in. And because we've got about 40 minutes, give or take. So we're going to go quickly to some pointed questions. One bit of housekeeping for everyone who is watching live. Jessica and I are going to save time at the end for Q&A. And here's how the easiest way to participate, actually the only way to participate in Q&A, if everyone will look at the bottom of their screen and just move their cursor over the bottom of the screen, you will see at the bottom right Q&A. And if you click on Q&A, you can simply type a question into Q&A. I will see it and I will ask the question of Jessica at the end, or respond if it relates to me. So we're not using chat at the bottom, which actually is not at the bottom, thankfully, but we are using Q&A. So in order to begin, I want to frame this conversation, Jessica, and say that one of my working principles for this whole series, and certainly for our director of Christian formation, whose name is Tina Clark, Tina shares this goal as well, that for this political series, we want to get very precise on complex questions there's a lot of passion and disagreement in our country, to some degree in our parish about. But as we do that, my assumption is that there are people of goodwill across the political spectrum. And certainly for people of faith who are related to the Episcopal Church, we all, even though we have very different political opinions and might vote differently, we all share this baptismal covenant, which has language in it such as, will you seek and serve Christ in all persons? Will you strive for justice and peace? So these sort of lofty Christian Episcopalian goals that really are Christian goals that we all share. And so that the call to action, the call to participate is shared across ideology. So one of my working assumptions is that there are people of goodwill across the political parties and that spectrum. And I know you share that value. Do you mind saying a bit about that before we dive into questions, other questions?
Absolutely. And I love that is the way that we're beginning this conversation. I want to share a little bit about sort of where I'm coming from in the grand field of political science, and it fits directly in with what you just sort of opened us with. So my area of expertise and research and interest is really focusing on the way that societies deal with violent and unjust pasts and their connection to our present. And so the field that is generally called transitional justice, the way that we think about what has come before and how we deal with the consequences in the present. So I teach and research prosecutions, truth commissions, reconciliation. And as I have been doing that over the last decade, one of the really major elements that has come out of it is this recognition that there is so much that can be done on the front end before atrocities and this type of social violence occur. And one of the major elements that I focus on in my classes with my students is looking at our social environment and finding ways to widen the circle of who is considered to be us. And so really thinking about the ways that our interactions with individuals and with institutions can either other individuals or can include them in a wider and wider circle of who is us. And you'll see that theme is connected into much of what we talk about today, but it directly relates to sort of this ethic that we're bringing into the conversation. So I'm really pleased.
Good. And I would just do one little response to that, and then we'll dive into other questions. But I love how you put that. And one reason why, I mean, the image of widening the circle is beautiful and interesting. And, one thing that it makes me think about, and we're going to talk about everything more politically, but in terms of theology or spirituality, truth is not a possession. Truth is a transcendent reality that no one can manipulate or possess on their own. And I think when you begin thinking in that way about things like truth or justice, it levels the playing field, and it puts us all in a posture of search, and all in a posture of dependence across all these divides. With that in mind, across the political spectrum, it feels like that we're in, I don't know if we're at the end of the beginning, or at the beginning of the end of this incredible erosion of trust, an erosion of a sense of truth being independent of the way we're able to manipulate it or create it. What do you make of this erosion of trust, and kind of where are we in the transition on that? It doesn't feel great.
Yeah, I agree. It's very disorienting. So this is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about in my work and in my personal life as well. And I would say that, I mean, I think there are some major factors that we can cite that many of us are pretty aware of. You know, the presence and ubiquitousness of social media as a form of gathering information, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. But increasing inequality in our own country that has an erosion effect on trust in people who are, you know, our neighbors, but also our trust in institutions, um, and the perception of corruption at a government level, or wastefulness, or individuals functioning for their personal interest as opposed to the interest of the larger community. So I think there are dynamics that we can point to that are related to this sense of an erosion of trust and a sort of post-truth context that feels pretty uncomfortable for us. But I want to idea of social media in relation to our traditional forms of media. And so one of the concepts or themes that really helps me think this dynamic is out of the work of a scholar named Benedict Anderson, who talks about imagined communities. And imagined communities is his way of discussing really the concept of national identity and nationalism, or sort of a national culture. And his major contribution to the discussion is that our form of media, the way that we take in information as a society, has a really strong impact on the way we understand ourselves as a society. And so he goes way back. He's a historian. He goes way back to the printing press, and talks about how when you have this shared distribution of information, and also like he goes into language. I won't go into those details, but the shared distribution of information is really has a social impact because it creates a sense of a shared community of who is reading this material, right? And so if we think about the fall of the Berlin Wall, you know, for those of us who were alive at that time, who were experiencing it, or even September 11th, you know, a little more recent. We have this experience where we were relatively all on the same page. You know, most people opened the newspaper or watched the news and saw the narrative of what was happening, and they could then go out of their homes and out of their schools and workplace and assume that the people around them had received that same narrative and that same understanding of what had happened. And that creates a sense of what it means to be American and what it means to be part of this national community. And so if we think about the role of social media has a really opposite effect, because we are all getting, even if, you know, I'm sitting next to my husband or my coworker or my best friend, we could be getting totally different narratives, and we are getting completely different narratives about what's happening and about what forms our social world. And so I think that if we wanted to think about an antidote or a way to try to foster a greater sense of trust, or a greater sense of ability to establish a communal truth, I would encourage people to use social media judiciously, but also to really get out and connect with the community that is in our personal environment. And that's one of the wonderful things about churches, right? You know, we can come together even in a virtual environment, and all religious communities, we can come together in a religious environment and talk about our shared narrative and what's happening and how we understand it. And then the other point that I want to make is that although it is unsettling to feel like there's this major disconnect between us and many members of our community. That disconnect and talking about the disconnect is a public good.
Mm.
And so it is our environment, and we'll come back to this at the end, I think, but our political environment is healthy when there is disagreement and we can talk about that disagreement.
The image of communal truth is wonderful. And again, you and I are primarily talking politically. I mean, your PhD is in politics, and you teach at the political science department. But the notion of truth is deeply religious or spiritual, and the notion of a communal truth has real resonance across religious traditions. So I love that. One of the things that it makes me think about is the role of, especially in the United States and the West, the rise of individualism, and that being a kind of factor. We tend, no matter what our spectrum, our view is, we tend to see people as individuals, not as communities. And so to give a very pointed example that'll help us shift to the next question, when you see a terrible act like a police shooting or police brutality against an African American who's unarmed, sometimes the political debate seems to divide between people who see that African American as a representative of a larger group, and therefore the role that race and white supremacy plays, versus others who see it as a mere individual, an act against a mere individual who's disconnected from a larger communal truth. And I just flag that. I think the notion of communal truth affects us across the board on so many things that we face. And it's an erosion of truth being having this transcendent reality that is not manipulated by an individual. But with that being said, it seems that both political parties in this country, that Republican and Democrat, have not adequately addressed the subject of race. What is your take on that?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for that introduction to the question. There's so much to unpack there. I want to come back to this idea of individuality and the concept of that as a Western cultural sort of dynamic. And I absolutely see what you're referring to. And I want to sort of add in this idea that we have these generalizations that we can make about our own society or societies, which are useful for getting a sense of social dynamics. And then also, I'm always push back on that generalization and say, but what is it within that community that the heterogeneity within that community that allows us to understand the dynamic of that even more? And I think your question gets right at it. So I would agree absolutely that our political system, even more broadly than just our political parties, has really inadequately addressed race in the United States context. And this is for a number of reasons, and I think it has a lot to do with our language around race. So I would say I am learning about this as a white woman, and having grown up in the 80s and 90s, I actually see sort of the narrative, the story that I got about race just from my surrounding environment as very applicable to thinking about our political system and our political parties today. So much of what I sort of received as wisdom on race had to do with sort of a colorblind ideology, which comes from a good place. It comes from, sometimes people will make the reference back to Dr. Martin Luther King's wish for his children to be able to see not for the color of their skin, right, but for the quality of their character. And so it comes from a good place, but it has morphed into an ideology that if we don't name race, if we, as a white person, if I don't name race, if I don't talk about it, that it's not there, that it's not relevant, and that what that does is, first of all, it is oblivious to the fact that I am a racial being. Like, race is a dynamic of being white as well as being African American, Hispanic, Arab, Asian, and any of the other racial categories we might pick. But it also is a dynamic, the consequence of it is to ignore an incredibly potent and important element of identity for large swaths of our population. And I really think that our institutions, our political parties, our political general is going through this sort of personal or sort of an identity crisis in recognizing that we have for a long time tried to kind of function in a colorblind manner, and it doesn't work. It creates pain. And so I think that our parties are attempting, our political system is attempting to address that. And part of that address is, it comes into my area of research. I mean, there has been for a long time, there have been voices in Congress that have called for a bill of reparations. And the term reparations might feel, I mean, there's people probably have a lot of different perspectives on reparations, but the bill, HR 40, that has been brought up every congressional session for discussion and has not been adopted, but is on discussions of the presidential by presidential candidates right now.
Right.
The bill, which is about reparations, is asking for a congressional inquiry of review to establish the truth, to establish what happened, to establish a historic record, right, about the legacy of slavery, about Jim Crow era harms, about the ongoing connection between those things and ongoing segregation and racial inequality and police brutality that disproportionately impacts communities of color. So that bill, I come back to that because I strongly believe the logic behind that, which is, in order for us to understand the role of race and the painful history that race relations has in our past and in our contemporary context, we have to understand and have a better collective understanding of what has happened. And as a white person, that the responsibility of that is primarily on my shoulders, because I have had the luxury, and some people might dispute that term, but I have been able to grow up without knowing that history. Mm-hmm. And that's where I come back to the way that you open this question, because my sense is that for many communities, minority communities, communities of color, African Americans, Hispanics, a wide variety of communities in the US, the concept of community versus individual is more fraught. And that there is, and so part of our ability to think about Western culture as directly related to individualism also has a bit to do with that colorblind ideology that Western culture encompasses the white experience. And so we have a more rich understanding and a more complete understanding of it when we link in the fact that communities that have been here the whole time, sometimes some of those communities are emphasizing the communal element way more than the individual. So.
Wonderful answer, and two things that come to mind just to give people who might be listening resources to go a little bit deeper. One that's a little Episcopal centric, so to speak, but in South Africa, coming out of apartheid, the country put together, as you're aware, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was their version 20 or so years ago, actually 40 years ago now, of doing exactly what you're suggesting as a country. Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, it was chaired by the Archbishop, Desmond Tutu, who is an Episcopalian or Anglican. And Tutu's book on that Truth and Reconciliation Commission is called I believe, no future without forgiveness. And it's an incredible documentation of his chairing of that group. The other piece that comes to mind that shows this subtle and not so subtle connection between religion and between theology or religion and politics is the role of memory. Memory as a religious concept across religions is profound and powerful. We need to remember in order to know where we are and have any hope of having hope, anticipating where we're going. And I've heard Brian Stevenson, whose book is called Just Mercy, and Stevenson is an Alabamian and a lawyer in Montgomery. The movie Just Mercy is about him, his book by the same title. And I've heard he's opposed to the death penalty, police brutality, wants police reform, all of these things. And one of the things he argues is that if we as a country don't remember and do this truth-telling bit and tell these stories and listen collectively, the image he uses is that we will be haunted by these ghosts for the rest of our lives. And so his book is a good one to check out as well.
Yes, Just Mercy.
And then remind us of the bill, the HR one more time, just in case.
It's called HR 40. And I'm so glad that you brought up the work of the Equal Justice Initiative, which is the organization that Brian Stevenson has founded, because it's really the preeminent organization in the United States today that has, from my perspective as someone who teaches, I mean, this is my topic. This is what I spend my time with students on. It's the organization that has understood that reality, which is that not only will we be haunted, but it is embedded in our daily lives. We will not, I believe very strongly, and I know that the work of that institution supports this, we will not be able to overcome the major challenges that have been endemic to our experience, our political experience from our founding, without reckoning, without understanding that truth. And they're doing an incredible job at identifying through memorials, through the telling of history. So I really encourage anyone who's interested to go and check out their website. They are most, I think, profoundly famous for their documenting of lynchings in the South.
Yes.
And the way that they are memorializing it physically. So I could talk about that all day, but I'm really glad you brought that up.
Thank you. So let's pick up our speed a little bit.
Okay.
So I want you to just give a quick answer to this one. What's the global perspective on President Trump and this election? And that's a massive question as big as the world, but can you just give just a brief response to that?
And so I come at this from a foreign policy perspective. It's another area that I focus on. So really, I mean, this presidential administration has been disorienting for our global community, for our allies, as well as those our foes, we might say, because the Trump administration has been willing to break with tradition and norms that have traditionally governed not only domestic politics, but really international dealings and the way that we function in the international system since the end of World War II. World War II is really the point at which we see the United States launching as a global superpower, and the rules of the game for how we function in the global world were set at that point, and they have been they have been functioning in that time. Sorry, I have a little puppy with me.
Take your time.
I'm just going to close the door. 1 second, please.
You're fine. Take your time. As you are doing that, Jessica, I want to remind everyone viewing, if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A. The Q&A is at the bottom of the screen. If you click on it once, you can then do a second click that is type answer. We're not going to do hand raises. We're not going to cut to other people's screens. So if anyone has a question, please type it in the Q&A. And also, if you would go ahead and do that now, it helps me gauge how much time we have left for other questions that I have on my list to ask. Jessica, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm sorry for that interruption. So we've seen a willingness in this administration to break norms. And the reason I use the term norm is because they're the way that the United States has functioned in the global system since the end of World War II, and even to some extent since our existence, that were very rarely named. They were assumptions that we as citizens and that global partners or actors could assume was just sort of how the world works. And so it's been very interesting and challenging, I think, for the international system, for other actors to feel that unpredictability. We've seen that in interviews with ambassadors and foreign dignitaries. It's a very clear statement from them. I think that the other sort of dynamic that this election reminds us of is that it has this administration, and also, I mean, I would say the last 3 administrations in certain ways have really demonstrated to the global community how volatile American politics can be, and how we as a country and as a global system in many ways are subject to the whims of our political institutions. And so the fact that we have a habitual overturn between the two parties, which often results in sort of a pendulum swing of policies, that is a very, it's a precarious experience for international actors. And I think that this administration, more than others, has demonstrated that there is relatively little that can be counted on as permanent in terms of American foreign policy. And that, I think, is disorienting. And I do not think that that will be changed. That is a lesson that will not be unlearned, no matter who goes into office. So if we have a second Trump administration, I think that will continue to be true. If we have a Biden administration, there will still be that lesson that American institutions are in many ways in crisis, and they are unpredictable, and that remains president.
And that is also something we could talk about for a couple of hours as well.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for that. I am looking at the chat, so I'm gonna keep going with my questions for now. You mentioned in a conversation with me last week a real fatigue with the news, and so many of us feel that. What's that fatigue stem from? We've been through elections before, so the elections aren't new. The divisiveness is it might be more extreme today, but the fatigue feels is it new, and what is that and about?
Yeah, I think it's new, but that's just my anecdotal perception. I think it does come to our sources of media that, and our consumption of media.
Sure.
That's obvious to say, but the distinction between, opening a paper that we get once a day or twice a day maybe, versus having our phone with us that we could look at before we go to bed and when we wake up is exhausting. But I also think that there is a lot going on in the world today. I mean, part of it is that we are getting more information about more things because we have such a multitude of sources of information. So whereas before, for example, we would be getting most of our international news from 1 or 2 news sources, or even from 1 or 2 international sources, or even domestic sources of information. Now, social media and all sorts of institutions. And so I think about, for example, like the existence today of ongoing mass atrocities that are happening that we would think, in sort of a traditional media environment, we would think like that would be rocking everyone's world. That would be front page news all the time. And yet we see the incredible violence that's being inflicted on the Uyghur community in China, uh, the ongoing violence in Kashmir, India. I mean, these are just, I mean, there's no end to the list. There are massive violations, human rights violations going on today that, if we're aware of, they are exhausting because there are so many, and we may not even be aware of them. And that in itself is disorienting when we interact with people who are aware of them and we're not. I'm just picking the one slice of info that is my sort of focus, but pick anything else like healthcare, the elections, right? So I think to some extent it is a quality of our political environment in 2020, and has been growing. And I also think I'm really, this is something that we're talking about because I think many of us are feeling it, and it can be really daunting and overwhelming and exhausting. And I think it's a sign that we need to individually adopt and work on practices of centering, whatever tradition we draw from, whether it is a belief in a deity or a more like agnostic perspective,
Yeah.
or a particular religious perspective, but that we need to come back to sort of what fills us up. And yeah, I just think that's really important. I
Yeah.
was reflecting on the fact that I was feeling drained going into this, and thought, this is my profession. I bet other people are feeling drained too.
So I'll just chime in very quickly, and then we're going to do about 3 to 4 more minutes. We're going to pick up the
Okay.
pace even more. You use the image of communal truth, and I think that's relevant to how we get out of this fatigue. So looking for community conversations, looking for, and I think it's a combination of at least 2 different types. There's absolutely a place for community conversations among people who agree with one another and who have close connections and agreement and shared history. That could be at the level of race or neighborhood or religion, you name it. But there's a second type that brings a kind of risk, and it's a communal conversation that has more room for different types of experiences and perspectives, and that for that conversation to be safe, and to have some working assumptions like what we tried to start with, that there really are people of goodwill and intelligence across some of these divides. So what I long most for is different types of communal conversations and different types of spaces. What is, so we're down to really 2 questions. One, I'm actually 3. One, there's one that came through in the chat are we aware of the Braver Angels organization led by the former Bishop of New Jersey, Mark Beckwith? I am not. Are you familiar with
No,
Braver
I will look
Angels?
that up though.
So with that, 2 last questions, unless something else comes in through the chat. So let's try to do these pretty quickly, and then we'll wrap up, Jessica.
Okay.
What's the, and this is the one I want you to spend at least a couple of minutes on though. What's the one thing you want us to talk about before we break? And then I'm going to ask you about your book.
Okay. Yeah. And those 2 things are connected actually. So,
so I will say before you respond, if you don't mind, the title, your working manuscript title is Vanished: The Origins and Evolution of Enforced Disappearance.
Yeah. Yeah. So when I think about the kind of conversations that should be happening today and that I want to foster around the election, it's really, I think there is a very important dynamic that we see present in this election that has definitely not to this level, been present in recent elections. And that is the possibility of violence before or after the election. And it's a very sobering topic, but there have been a number of institutions, a number of nonprofit, NGO, non-governmental organizations that have flagged dynamics that are ongoing in the United States today that are similar to the types of dynamics that we see in other countries around election violence. I have a great colleague at Sewanee Dr. Paige Snyder, who works on election violence in other countries, and she and I and a number of other colleagues have been engaging in ongoing conversations about what we're seeing and observing. And so there, I think that that is something that is possible. And the way that I always make sure to frame it with my students is that it is not inevitable, that we have the ability to impact our local environments in ways that are important and meaningful, but that we're seeing a huge degree of polarization, and polarization particularly around our sense of threat and existential well-being. And so where we begin to see sort of the likelihood of violence is where we're seeing really very severe, what I would call break as opposed to bridging. And so this is language that comes from the Othering and Belonging Institute, which is a great organization. I encourage anyone to look it up. But breaking is basically the type of language or talking about our environment in ways that other different groups. And so creates an us versus them, and creates an environment in which we are focusing on scarcity and the threat to resources and our need to hold on to those resources. The opposite of that would be bridging, which is widening the circle of us, right? And so that is a really, when we see media rhetoric, media language, and language coming from high-level political officials that is emphasizing sort of scarcity and us versus them narratives, we are more likely to see when people feel there is a threat to their well-being, we're more likely to see violence. So I think that this is important. I think that it would be easy for us to look at this and say, that can never happen in the United States, which is not true. It has happened before. We have had election violence before. And we are not immune to this. This is, as someone who studies atrocities and mass violence and injustices, this can happen anywhere. And I'm not saying that I think that is going to happen, but I think that we need to be in tune with our environment and working in our daily lives to inhibit that type of dynamic. And I'll just bring up a brief example before we move on. So one of the things that I was observing as a parent of small children moving back into the school system was sort of the dynamic around masking with COVID. And COVID lays on this whole other element of existential threat and fear for all of us in many ways. And I noticed that in a lot of our conversations among parents and in relation to our local elementary school, there was a lot of language that was othering people around masking on both sides. The people who were very strongly in support of masking could not comprehend the perspective of someone who was an anti-masker, and vice versa. And the language that we were using in our community to talk about each other was dehumanizing language. It was language that was saying, well, those people are crazy, they're irrational, they are, one thing or another. And really it's that key element of the dehumanization that is so important and dangerous. And so I think that it's important for us to think about in our political discourse and in our political engagements and conversations, are there areas in which we don't understand someone and therefore we go to a dehumanization or to an othering of that person? The way that I encourage, if we go back to this masking discussion, something I've been working on with myself is to remember that the people who I disagree with on this particular issue, which can feel very much about my safety and my family's well-being, is that they are choosing the steps that they're choosing because it is what makes them feel safe. And that is a humanizing dynamic, right? And so even though I disagree with them, we're making our decisions about what makes us feel safe and what makes us feel like we can preserve what is important to us and of value. And we can come together on some of those values. And it's hard and challenging, but that I think being able to identify the dehumanization in our own language is very, very important.
So one just little kind of amen to that, and then I'd love for you to connect it to your book title, and then we will be done. The amen is dehumanizing another dehumanizes the dehumanizer.
Mm-hmm.
So we think it, when one does that, one thinks it's just about the other, but in fact, there's this, I don't know if it's a feedback loop, but it turns on yourself.
Absolutely. And we see that in a moral way. And we also see it, I mean, if in a social scientific manner, and there's a lot of evidence that supports that. I mean, a lot of the research on torture demonstrates that psychologically impacts for individuals who are being tortured and individuals who torture. Psychologically, it's very damaging on both sides.
How does it relate to the title of your book,
Yeah.
Vanished: The Origins and Evolution of Enforced Disappearances?
So enforced disappearance is a very particular type of human rights abuse. It is something that some of you may or may not be familiar with. You might have heard about it in the context of Latin America in the 70s and 80s. But to simplify, it's basically when government forces or those working with their support kidnap someone and place them outside of the protection of the law. And so it's not like there's a ransom for them or that they're in a prison and they can be located, but ultimately they are made to disappear. So it is impossible to find information about where they're being held, who took them, if they were taken by government forces. And that's what's called enforced disappearance. And it is a phenomena that many people became familiar with in the 70s and 80s in Latin America, but it's actually a phenomena that has been around longer than that. And so my work traces the origins and the evolution of that practice and how it is that we find ourselves today in an environment where authoritarian regimes as well as consolidated democracies contribute to and participate in this practice. So it's connected into the dehumanization. I'll just say this really quick, because one of the key elements that allows for the deployment of this practice in the wider population is the dehumanization of the other.
Mm. Well, I look forward to reading it one day, and all blessings, and may good angels and wonderful thoughts as you continue to write come to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
A necessary topic. We do have one last question, and we don't have much time, but Jim East, a member of our parish, asked, in your opinion, why are Democrats who talk about building bridges, why do they spend so little time talking to rural America about rural America's fears of being minimalized and marginalized? Great question. Yeah, can you give a brief response to that?
Yeah, I think that I wouldn't say that it's just a problem within the Democrats, although I think that the problem is probably exacerbated within the Democratic Party. But I think it has to do with class. I think the fact that our party system, our political environment is a very classist environment, and it takes a lot of money to be involved, particularly in national politics, but even really national politics, I would say. And that it has to do with an experience that many of our national politicians don't know of, that they themselves have not engaged with, even if they're coming from, and fewer of them are, Democrats are coming from rural, impoverished areas. So I think it has to do with, one's own experience and an inability to see sort of importance of a different experience. Yeah.
Very helpful, and I agree. I think the funding of elections and of campaigns plays a massive role in that. Dr. Mecellem, we are really grateful. Thank you so much for talking with us. And as we end, I am again Richard Lawson, Dean of the Cathedral. It's great to be here with all of you. This is the first of a three-part series on preparing for the election with other guests. The series will continue for the next 2 Sundays at 9 a.m. And for those who are interested, our service of morning prayer will launch on our website, sjcathedral.org, in about 8 minutes. And I would love to see you and pray with you there. Jessica, thanks so much. And you
Thank
take care.
you. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.